Okay, so good evening or good morning or whatever time it is when you might be watching this. But so welcome to an evening to mark the publication of a nice new shiny book about the NSK State and Time, which maybe you can hold up at the beginning so it looks like or starting off all formally. So we're just gonna have a sort of there we go, weapons of mass instruction. Cool. I really like that image. Who made the image?
Actually, that was one of almost 24 different poster designs for the first folk art biennale, which Carsten Busse from Leipzig did in 2012 already, I think, because we had initially planned to host the first NSK folk art biennale in 2013, and it got delayed to 2014. So the initial run of poster motives and designs Carsten must have produced already in 2012. And that is one of them, which was chosen by the publisher, which I like a lot because not only is it very stark in its contrast, but it also exemplifies the approach of the art historical eclecticism practiced by NSK State by combining Rodin's thinker with the Black Cross. So it basically gives you a fantastically concise visual idea of NSK State's approach to art and history and politics, reflecting on them, thinking and rethinking the state and everything that's connected with art, history, and politics, which NSK State likes to deal with, as we all know.
Good. So what we're going to do tonight is have sort of some discussion and sort of conversation around the NSK State as a way to sort of, let's say, gently welcome our newfound book friend into the world. And I think it should be quite interesting because, well, there's a lot of reasons why NSK State is interesting, but personally, I find one of the things most interesting about NSK State and Time is it's one of the few examples I can think of where a long-term collective art project shifts to being also something which is owned by and brought forward by people who started out as, let's say, as viewers or as the audience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And so that's quite interesting and unique. So maybe what we'll do is first I'll hand things over to you, Alexander. So just give it let's say introduction about, like, tell us about this book, how shiny it is, what great things are in it, that kind of stuff.
Well, basically, in terms of content, consists of 3 distinctly different parts, with the first part consisting of speeches and addresses delivered at various NSK State events throughout the years, opening with obviously an introduction about how the NSK State was conceived, etc., how the thing developed, for people who are not yet familiar with the concept as such. But the speeches themselves take off with Peter Mlakau's introductory speech, which he delivered during the opening of the first NSK Citizens Congress in Berlin in 2010. And the rest of the book pretty much covers the period from 2010 onwards, right up to the pandemic pause, which we endured after 2019, which I think is the most recent speech that is featured in the book. The second part consists of a variety of reports. For example, Bertrand Thibert from Lyon tells us about how the first NSK rendezvous, which was basically the first post-Congress gathering that was held, how that went along, because that was also not exactly easy to get done, as Alexei might remember. Also a couple of interviews, the one we had on occasion of the second Folk Art Biennale, and a variety of other archival writings or articles which have been published in various limited sources in the past, which I figured would make sense to include in a documentary book about the NSK State. also a couple of presentations which have been held in the meantime, focusing on various more specific topics. And the third part of the book consists of what we decided to call documents of liberation, as opposed to documents of oppression, because they basically is a collection of internal state-related material, which was circulated, for example, advice for people who would guard an exhibition if visitors ask them questions about NSK State, and you can't expect to have, you know, people who are there to just because they're working at an exhibition venue and aren't necessarily involved with the art that is being exhibited or with the theoretic theories behind. What I did back then in 2019 was to prepare a frequently asked questions list based on questions from the audience from the big Australe section featuring NSK State art in 2017 in Dresden, which seemed like a sensible thing to do in order to provide both people who were working in the exhibition with both short and a little bit more extensive replies to questions people might raise, as well as inform interested audiences, even when the key people who were involved in the exhibition itself weren't present at the gallery and stuff like that. So let me take a closer look. Also, there's a short self-descriptions from various NSK denominations and groups, like Neue Slowenische Kunst from Hungary, or the infamous NSK State Reserve, of course, about which Charles might shed a little bit more light on that perhaps later on, because as far as rumors go, there's also something in preparation for fall, but I'm not going to spoil it here. What else have we here? The Institute for Cultural Cassation. What is new Sorbian art? Also, the first reprint of the NSK newspaper, which was published on an occasion of the 57th Venice Biennale. And all of that is featured in both English and German. So we're practically covering every major language besides Slovene, which are spoken by the majority of NSK citizens, I hope. So yeah, so all these documents and reports and insights from various sources, which have previously been scattered and also, you know, sold out, like in cases of printed magazines or websites which have either disappeared or changed their appearance in the meantime. So I figured it would make sense for the NSK citizenry to be capable of accessing all these various and varied little bits and pieces of information.
I was going to ask sort of what was the impetus of putting together the book? Was it something to do with sort of just bringing together all the stuff that was already circulating but not easily circulating, or?
Yes, most of these speeches, for example, were held once, and most of them weren't recorded to end up on YouTube, or if they were, they might have been truncated or just fragments of the original events and so on. So I figured it would make sense to make all these various spots and specks in time available to people who weren't there by themselves. Like, for example, we were discussing the third Folk Art Biennale before we took off with this event, and Lily, who was the key person in setting that up, we were discussing the difficulties even in retrieving archival information and getting all that stuff together. So it must be incredibly more difficult for people who are not even involved in the organizing or the curatorial back and forths of setting up such events, much less being able to access the material that was presented in the moment. Because due to the pandemic, We've never actually gotten around to produce a catalog for the third Folk Art Biennale. So some of the artwork featured in the book are also partly something like a folk art catalog as well, because there's also a couple of color pages representing images either from events or artworks. So there's also the visual arts aspect of NSK State is also represented, also through, by means of photography and reproduced documents like the state visa and stuff like that throughout the book.
I certainly find it a useful document for my own purposes. I mean, to see all this material gathered and to get this timeline and to see the differences and the similarities between the different events and approaches, it's really an important document in that sense.
I think, or I hope, it may even represent some sort of precedent for an ongoing series of self-documentation work being done by NSK State citizens who are certainly active within their own geographic or temporal contexts, and perhaps not that intensely networked as we are, because honestly, the first Folk Art Biennale back in 2014 and the subsequent exhibitions or participations in larger exhibitions with NSK Folk Art would practically be impossible without the close association of people active within the state and for the state. So in practice, it is basically possible to churn out an exhibition featuring artists from all over the world within the better part of half a year, if you're given a bit of advance time, and you can actually set something like this up, which is amazing, because NSK State citizens are there and they're connected, but I'm pretty sure for every dozen NSK citizens who are actively interacting with each other, there must be 2 dozens more who are not that involved, possibly didn't even or weren't even aware of all the works and activities that were being done in the past 15 or 20 years, or even since the state was founded in 1992. I mean, even I was surprised by some of the findings rather, that I came across when putting the book together, because there were quite a few details or historical oddities that I had forgotten about or hadn't even been aware of before. So it is also not just a collection of documentation, of documents, but also documentation of that particular project through time, and possibly to be expanded upon in the future, depending on how many future NSK State events we're going to see, and judging by the dynamic that is already making itself felt even before the book was officially released, the day before yesterday. I'm receiving requests for book presentations and there were quite a few conversations about. I was at the Leipzig Book Fair this weekend, presenting the book in Leipzig, and there are also a couple of other books with NSK State relations in the works, shall we say. So this is practically the avant-garde of a phalanx of NSK State invasion, which is going to come in the form of books or maybe catalogs or events. So it seems like we finally gotten around to leaving the pandemic break behind us and get back at it with renewed energy.
I find it quite interesting to sort of include the speeches and particularly materials from Peter McClure, who I find super interesting, in part because as you were saying, there's a whole, let's say, a range of different kinds of interactions people can have with NSK related things. So you have, let's say, at one end you have like a super casual fan who like might know 1 or 2 Laibach songs, and then you have versus someone who's aware that there's other parts of the NSK, and there's all these other practices, and you can just have these like layers of oh, there's all these other things that actually I had no clue about, and the context for them and how they function. Maybe as a way to sort of dodge the conversation a bit. Matt, are you familiar with? Are there any sort of other comparable examples of sort of like collective art practices that then become sort of like taken on and pushed forward by their audience, who then become part of the practice itself? Is that a thing?
God, that's I mean, you're pretty better place to answer the question than I am. A horrible question to ask. The closest analogy, I think, actually, and it's not quite analogous, is the K Foundation, right? Like, I think the K Foundation, the KLF in the UK is probably the closest. And like, you know, I'm in no way an expert here, and I'm very humbled to be in all of the company of the people here, because I teach art and politics at the University of Essex, and you know, NSK and Laibach are at the kind of heart of some of my teaching on this. And I have some thoughts I maybe come back to later on about how I think this all fits into a bigger discussion about political art. But yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know. There are plenty of kind of artistic collectives, but I don't think any which have this kind of participatory involvement in the same way. And then what would you say, Stephen, were the comparators?
I wasn't really coming up with anything like it. That's why I kind of thought that.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, I think the nearest parallel, and it's really not very exact actually, is the K Foundation in the UK, because that took on a life of its own and has all these kind of tendrils. But it's obviously not as organized. It's not as you know, structured even in that kind of structured way as anything that NSK are doing.
But it's an interesting comparison.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, what always struck me about how, well, maybe I'll sort of say the notes I prepared, because it'll hopefully set up some conversation. So I teach, as I said, an MA module to art historians on art and politics, and what I find is that most of my students come who are they're very engaged in politics, sort of, you know, broadly conceived. But what they want when they start the module is political art that either, you know, it sort of gives them solutions, right? They want the art that they can hang on the wall that's going to save the world, or the art that they can produce that's going to save the world. And very quickly, I try and dissuade them of that thinking. And where we end up normally is this conversation about how, you know, I think the sort of failures of political art in general, certainly in recent decades, is because it falls into two categories, right? It falls into either didactic forms, so that's a kind of solutionism, you know, here's the picture that's going to save the world, or it's sort of illustrative. And we saw a lot of that in the kind of art of the Trump era, right? Like lots of just, look how disgusting Donald Trump is, or look how bad the world is. And I think both of those forms tend to fail because they don't tend to speak, well, they're not even able to speak beyond themselves. They speak to people already convinced of their premises and their solutions. So what I find so compelling about NSK and what I try and get across to my students, and this is where I think actually the K Foundation are a useful comparison too, because they sort of do the same thing, is that they create a kind of space, you know, it has utopianism in it, and it has hope in it, and it has optimism in it, and it has joy in it, but it's neither illustrative nor in a didactic way, nor is it sort of solutionistic. And I like to take that, you know, that phrasing of Benjamin Bouclot's of cynical realism, which he means as a criticism of pop art, basically, and kind of invert it, right? Like realistic cynicism. I'm really drawn to artists like NSK, broadly conceived, and like the K Foundation, who I sort of teach in back-to-back weeks, because I think they kind of engage this in their kind of presentation and in their practice, engage in this kind of something we might broadly call cynicism, to create space for conversation and to create space for you know, some kind of formation of some kind of politics that isn't reductive in neither of those two ways. So Yeah, I mean, as I said, this is I feel very humbled to be in the presence of Alexei and of Lily and of Alex, because I'm by no means an expert on any of this stuff, but I find the whole and there's a there's a tradition of this kind of stuff, I think, and there is a kind of group of artists which I think work in this way, whose work I find interesting. But I think in many ways, like I make my students watch the kind of final scenes of the Liberation Day documentary, and it's always a very emotional moment because you can sort of see that working in real time. So yeah, I mean, I have a lot more thoughts on that, but that's basically my take on this stuff. Is that I don't have the kind of in-depth thinking. I haven't published on any of this stuff yet to really put it in the context in the way you are, Stephen. But I think that for me, what I find so compelling and so useful about everything that the NSK have done since 1980s is because they work in a way which is, I mean, it's difficult, it's dangerous, it's prone to risk, it's a difficult line to walk, but I think their praxis manages to avoid those two dead ends, I think, that most political art otherwise falls into.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, particularly I understand what you're saying about there being an element of utopia, but one of the things I think there oftentimes a problem with sort of political utopian art is that there's this very sense of closure to it, where it's just you have, and there almost with any NSK related project, there's never any closure because you're always feeling a bit disturbed, a bit sort of uneasy. Things come together which don't necessarily belong together.
Well, yeah, but also it's about creating spaces for discussion. I think I'm sort of increasingly convinced that art itself is not useful, on its own politically, but lots of political artists might want to claim that. And I think particularly what's so useful about the metaphors and the practices of the NSK State in time is that it is this kind of illustration of the creation of a space for politics to happen rather than doing politics itself. And it's a real rarity, I think, that kind of practice. And we start the module. I didn't always, but I was teaching the module literally the morning that Trump was elected, and the module's become a bit of a reflection on the weakness of art of political art in the last decade or so, certainly. And much of that weakness is because the artists that engage with these topics and all the horrible things that are happening in the world right now are doing so either illustratively or didactically. And I think what's so beautiful, as I said, about what NSK do is that they've always been anti-didactic, I think. Even though clearly there is a kind of as I said, there's a kind of utopianism in there somewhere. There's a hopefulness in there somewhere, but it's not presented as such.
Maybe that's an interesting segue over to thinking about the various folk biennales that have happened. I'm trying to think of Lily, were you involved in organizing one of them? I'm sorry. I think you're muted.
Yeah. Yes, the 2018 one in Terbourg. Well, just this second, it crossed my mind that one of the problems of our biennials and all organization is funding, or how we put these things together. For example, the Terbourg was possible because the director of Delovski Dom gave us a place to use, in whatever way we wanted. So he supported us immensely with that gesture. But otherwise, I think it was about 29 people exhibiting. And it was quite varied. And also, yes, we introduced, in that one, we introduced performance. We had a magician And we had another performance on the top of Mount Kum, with a group of German artists. So I think this was like a new step in.
And there was also a wedding
In
in the same context. The NSK wedding, which Alex
Oh yes,
initiated.
oh
us.
right, yeah.
Yes, that was
Sarah.
in July of 2017. That was basically right in between two folk art biennales. Yeah, an official NSK wedding, which I had the honor to preside over, which was a very touching event. You'll find the wedding speech in the book as well.
Oh, yeah.
And a beautiful picture, because the invitation to the wedding guests included the order given by the happy couple that people were expected to appear wearing or being dressed in some kind of uniform, which turned out quite interesting results. All sorts of various uniforms were present and shown at the wedding. For example, nurses' dresses, or even Napoleonic costumes, and one guest even turned up as disguised as Mickey Mouse, which is also a sort of uniform in pop culture. So yeah, that was quite a fanciful event, and people were really having fun expounding on the idea of what can a uniform be, what is perceived as perhaps not exactly a uniform in the military sense, but ultimately functions as such. And yeah, it was a beautiful event, really nice. There's also a great two-page spread color picture in the book, giving a beautiful view of the wedding guests, in attendance.
And worth mentioning that the bride was a delegate at the NSK Citizens Congress in 2010.
Right, yeah.
There's a direct through link to that.
I
One of
suppose
the probable connections.
one of the things I find interesting about the Biennale is that you're not just having an exhibition or a series of events or a wedding for that matter, but you're doing it within a particular framework that has these various histories coming along with it, and which I'm just curious, sort of like what was your sort of like motivation, or sort of like you're saying, okay, let's do this thing, like because the first folk biennale was that 2013, was it? Sorry, I should know this history.
In 2014, it was initially planned to take place in 2013, but certain logistical problems had to be cleared up beforehand, obviously, in arranging for us to be able to get the Werkschauhalle, which is Hall 14 on the Spinnerei area in Leipzig, which is a huge a former cotton industry place, which has subsequently been turned into an entire area filled with little ateliers, galleries, workshops, where artists have their shops and do their work. And yeah, the Hall 14 is dedicated to, shall we say, experimental exhibitions, and it's a huge place, and it was quite an enterprise to get it done, to be honest. I think there were roughly 50 or 60 artists involved, if not more. I may be wrong there, but it was amazing. The idea or the suggestion, to answer your question, was proposed by Carsten Busse, a Leipzig-based artist who is now running the Salon Similde in Leipzig-Konnewitz, together with Alexander Pelemann, who is also an expert in Eastern European underground culture and subversive art strategies during the era of the Eastern Bloc countries, who had relocated to Leipzig shortly before the Congress event in Berlin happened, And basically in the aftermath of the Congress, was a group gathering in Leipzig, which subsequently used to call itself NSK Lipsk, using the Sorbian name of Leipzig, Lipsk, to denote their location, as well as their inclination to be perceived as a concise group. And Carsten turned up at one of these gatherings, which were taking on a regular nature, and simply suggested, why not have a folk art biennale? Like a global representation, an art collection manifesting the individual approaches from a variety of people who've interacted or dealt with NSK State, whether or not they were citizens formally or not. And that was basically the seed of the idea. And with the concept including the proposition that the Leipzig group would put on this first biennale and then basically hand the baton over to somebody else who would put on a second biennale in some other place, and then just to see what was going to happen in the future, because NSK State activities have a certain tendency to produce unexpected results way down the line, sometimes even years or decades on. So yeah, the idea was just to throw it out there and see what happened, basically. And as it turns out, Alexei, you were involved in setting up the second folk art biennale. Lily put on the third one. Yeah, so maybe one of the long-term effects of the post-pandemic activities we're witnessing and preparing right now might even result in another biennale sometime in the future.
Part of what I was asking that is I haven't been involved formally in any of the NSK folk art biennales. The closest thing I've been involved to something like that is actually this would have been 10 years ago. I took part in what I think is probably the only NSK State baptism, as in like baptizing a baby. And Alexei was there. This was in 2012 at a bookstore near the Tate Modern where Laibach was playing, and a number of members of Irwin were there, and it was basically a kind of almost kind of members of Irwin and Peter McClure, and it was more or less a kind of like a naming ceremony or sort of a welcoming. My son Gustav was born in 2012, and we had a sort of ceremony for him, baptism. And I think the reason for that is because at that point we was realizing that, like, even though he was born in the UK, he was not eligible automatically for UK citizenship. So it was actually the NSK state passport was actually the first state passport he received. Although we've never tried to cross a border with it, except metaphorically. But yeah. But just thinking of that kind of position of sort of turning to a particular practice and almost in a moment of confusion, trying to work through what are we finding ourselves in that particular case, very very literal questions about nationality, belonging, and legal status, and sort of not using art as a practice as a solution or a utopia, but mostly saying, I'm here, I can't make sense of it. What can we do to almost like think through things together? I'm going to just quickly call on Bernadette, who's had her digital hand raised for a long time.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm not sure. I don't think I'm on mute. Yeah, I just wanted to say something in reply partly to Matt. I also teach art and politics, but I teach it from a politics department in Goldsmiths. And so my students are not art historians mainly. We occasionally have art historians, but they're too frail generally to join our program, which is can be combative. And I also have an NSK passport, which I've had for a long time. But in response to this question about, what might be comparable to some of NSK activities, I think there are some things which in a limited way might be. I mean, I was thinking of Jonas Stahl's New World Summit, for instance. You know, the artistic and political organization that develops parliaments with and for stateless states and autonomous groups. And while passports are not issued for that, it is very much a deliberate attempt to question the kind of nation state dominated politics that I think NSK somehow manages also to share similar concerns with. And it also popped into my mind as well that just in terms of artists who issue passports, so obviously they don't have the same kind of the breadth and depth of activities that NSK have. People like the Palestinian artist Kayla Jarrar or the Swedish artist Lars Vilks. You know, Lars Vilks' micronation was going for years and years before he passed away recently, and it was hugely popular, and to the extent that his fight with local Swedish authorities about the impromptu structures that he was making in fjords were stopped from being pulled down because mostly of the citizen activity. And I'm glad to say I was a citizen of Lars Vilks' micronation as well. But it seems to me that there are parallels there that you can draw. I'm sure that these others are influenced by NSK, but really, so I wanted to just make those passing observations and see what other people thought about that. But I also wanted to ask Alexander how he feels the kind of legacy of NSK is being received and understood by younger people today. I mean, I have often have Slovenian and ex-Yugoslavian students who see NSK as being kind of, oh, granddad, you know, sort of age group. And while they're intrigued by it, they don't quite know what to make of it. So that's one question. And I suppose the second question I want to ask really is to do with the one that probably everyone will have thought of already, which is to do with, and Brian Holmes talks about it, obviously, in his work, where he discusses the kind of overdetermination of the totalitarian symbolism of NSK. And it seems to me that now, post-Ukraine war, that this is taking on a new kind of relevance. And I wondered what Alexander thought of some or any of these observations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. I'm honestly not really sure whether I can satisfably answer your first question, because I myself am too old to die young, so it's probably a bit not for me to take the place of the younger generations and talk in their stead. Maybe I can relate my own first contact, so to speak, with Laibach and NSK art when I was a teenager, basically, who didn't know what was going on and that was happening to him when I first heard get the Laibach version of Get Back on an independent radio station back in the 80s. But I was so irritated or fascinated by what I heard that I got curious and went on to buy the album. And not exactly having been a fan of the Beatles beforehand, I was quite impressed by the sheer range, the sonic range, and the means that Laibach used to basically turn out an album that made you understand how well written these songs were, even in an arrangement that's strange. Like, they delivered the Beatles album totally non-Beatles way, which I enjoyed immensely, considering that my parents used to be into the Beatles and my father used to be a rock musician himself in the 60s. So I played the get back track to him, like, Dad, come here, you got to listen to this. It's a fantastic version of a Beatles song. And he was like, oh, dude, go away with this stuff. Like, he'd never intended to have like a conflict with his kids about anything related to music, but he said, oh, go away with Laibach, never mention it again. And short while later, some Friday night when I came home, they were sitting watching TV, a cultural magazine in Germany called Aspekte, which had a report about Laibach performing in Hamburg at the Schauspielhaus when they did the Macbeth soundtrack. So that's when I first figured, okay, this seems like a little bit more than just your regular indie punk, avant-garde, underground, experimental group, you know. There was more to it. And when I got hold of the Christ album and first discovered the variety of visual art, theater involved in that production, and saw the NSK organizational structure on that poster, it struck me as, okay, these dudes are just part of something much bigger. And that's when I got hooked and intrigued and more or less began to investigate what else was there to be found, you know, behind the Alps. And that was even before the wall came down. So it was quite interesting because it was strange, it was intriguing. And I hope that even today, if and when young people discover that there is more to pop culture than just, you know, what's in the charts at any given time, that once they get in touch with Laibach or Irwin visual art or NK design, there's such a variety of access to the NSK world that I keep running into people, you know, studying at art colleges or something, whose first exposition to NSK wasn't even Laibach, but visual arts. That is kind of interesting because they have an entirely different approach in terms of discovering the various deeper levels and layers of NSK's Gesamtkunstwerk when entering that world and finding out about all the other groups and all the individual citizen activities and so on. If there's any curiosity left in the younger generations, I assume it might be triggered by getting accidentally touched by evil. And as an attempt to answer your second question about the new relevance of the symbolism used by NSK and subsequently NSK State, the conclusion I arrived at after working both practically and theoretically with the state and the context of NSK and how they work in the 80s, I've come to perceive NSK as an art movement and NSK State as a social experiment, rather in terms of a toolkit than a particular art school or a movement as such, especially when compared to the classic avant-garde movements of the 20th century, who usually were flashes in the pan and appeared and disappeared a short while after. And looking at the NSK history, there's now more than 4 decades of activity, and there doesn't seem to be any intent on giving up on that. So as far as I know, it's the longest lived avant-garde movement so far. And why shouldn't it go on to infinity? Since the time is the territory of NSK State, infinity is logically part of its concept. But speaking of the toolkit as such, and symbolism and the various eclectic art practices found in NSK art, to me, provide a template, especially when talking about the state form and the concept of creating a state which is both utopian by nature, but also points out the dystopian elements which are capable of turning any utopian ideal project or idealistic project into its very opposite. as a warning and portraying utopia as a work in progress. So to me, this template of NSK State gives me the possibility even to understand and grasp, in comparison to this ideal utopian state that we create in our minds, and compare to that the, if you will, hidden reverse of the actual existing state I'm living in and that other people are living in theirs. So it enables us to compare the actual practical political reality of the states we are part of in our everyday life with this idealistic utopian template. And that gives us not only the space for debate or rethinking politics that Matt mentioned, but even makes obvious and perceivable where actually existing states produce ideologies of their own, which in practice are but their opposite. And to diagnose that and criticize that is a position that NSK State and NSK Art can help to access for oneself and give you the opportunity and the means to even do this analysis and come to conclusions about our actually existing states and how they are failing or succeeding, depending on what you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I mean, sorry if I may just respond to that, because that's a brilliant answer. I mean, I think that's exactly for me why NSK continues to be valuable, because of the ability to create this kind of toolkit. For me, someone like Kayla Jarrah has used exactly the instruments that NSK have sort of designed and provided to reimagine in his case, the State of Palestine logo, which then becomes an actual political practice. It's not a piece of political art. It's a challenge at the border. It's not a border, is it? It's in Israel. It's not actually a border. That's the problem. But, you know, the idea that someone can present what looks like a Palestinian passport, including Zizek, who did it as well. But also when you look at the way that people like Janusz Jansa in Axioma, who obviously have, you know, learned very much, not just from the legacy of NSK, but from their close proximity to NSK as well, and have used that exact strategy of taking the state on, as it were, but, you know, in a very, again, overdetermined way, but then turning it into a mockery, which Laibach doesn't do. So for me, these are tools which continue to be incredibly powerful ones. So thank you for your answer. I can see that Matt's dying to get in again here, so I'll let him. Thank you.
I just want to say, I think College Ross, and I completely agree, perfect parallel. I guess I want to quibble a bit with Lars Vilks as a comparator, because I think the difference between what he's doing, and I always take my students when we go to Vienna, I take them to the Kugelmugel as well, like that micronation in Vienna, which is sort of similar in some ways. I think the key difference between, like, this is sort of what Alexander was touching upon there with this idea of infinity, right, is that the NSK state refuses to have a state. And I think Vilks and the other micronations, they're kind of, in some senses, building a possible set of alternatives. And I don't think it's entirely without interest and without affect, but like, I'm sort of super interested in this. And I think Khaled Jarrah's does this too, actually, like what I've called the abrogation of artistic responsibility, right? Like, people want artists to give them, as I said, certainly my students, and I think gallery goers and audiences to art, like, want solutions to things. They want art to make them feel good. And when artists refuse to do that, when you say you're going to give someone a state and you refuse to establish one, I think that frustration and confusion and, you know, the invited response of sort of that cynical positioning, which prompts a response of confusion, frustration, anger, annoyance, irritation, like, that seems to me a really important mode of what's happening. You know, like Gerard's work, where he says, you know, what's his work? If I don't steal your home, someone else will. That's precisely the point, right? Like, he's not going to show you a better future. He's just going to, you know, at least sort of cynically position himself as profiting from the reality of the circumstance. And I think the key difference between for me at least, the NSK state in time is that it exists only in time. I think in a weird way, the physicality and the sort of practical realities of what Wilkes and the other kind of micronations of that kind of doing, which are born out of weirdly legitimate and specific planning concerns, even if they have bigger reaches. I think it's the kind of refusal to have any specificity, which is what excites me so much, and what I find so productive about the NSK approach to things.
I mean, I think you've painted Lars Vilks' work as being a bit more determined than it is. I mean, anybody who can turn a micronation into an ISBN number, you know, is a pretty slippery. But also the third, and I'm not meaning to say that they are similar. I don't think they are, but I think that they have learned from NSK. I think they're drawing on that toolkit that Alexander is talking about, and in a way, Jonas Stahl, in a very different way, is doing that, because he's literalizing this idea of, you know, the state being an aesthetic form, and then looking to the stateless state as being something that needs thinking about as well, which, you know, is kind of interesting. So again, I mean, if you were to kind of try to imagine a trajectory where that might have started, and I've talked to Jonas about his work, but he hasn't mentioned NSK to me, but I'm sure he will have thought about it. And it seems to be these are all artists who are actually proposing. What they're doing is not really sitting very clearly under the category of art either. I mean, I think of it as not art. You know, it has to have a kind of double negative. And so much of what NSK does sort of falls into that. It's got a wonderful indeterminacy that actually allows it then to continue to raise questions. So yeah, I mean, sorry, not wanting
no,
to.
I think we're in agreement about that. I think
yeah.
you're right.
Yeah. Thanks.
I think what I've always found sort of super interesting and useful about NSK related projects is I come from a sort of tradition of art and politics that puts more emphasis upon the minor, the marginal, the resistant, and I love that stuff. I literally run a press called Minor Compositions, right? But what I love about the NSK, and also on projects like Test Department, is realizing that you don't have to stay with the minor and the marginal. There's no reason that you can't inhabit spaces of monumentality and say, actually, this is mine or this is ours. And you can draw upon different traditions of representation and sort of depiction and state formation, and use that, connecting it to resistant politics rather than having to always stay with the small and the marginal. So it provides you a sort of set of techniques that, I guess this is the toolkit, that you don't find in other projects.
I think at the heart of the NSK project, or maybe its intellectual root, lies in paradoxical thinking, and that in itself functions as a sort of safety net against being appropriated in the way that you know, maybe commercializing or going global would otherwise imply, in terms of you know, being part of some sort of cultural industry or the Western art system, or whatever it may be construed as. The NSK state always and automatically always carries its own negation with it inside, or maybe even the seed of its own self-destruction and self-abolition, if you want. So it's always, it's never, like Matt said, it's brilliantly put, a state that refuses to become a state, or a static in that sense. So it always implies the possibility to be even more than encompassing infinity as it claims by making itself a state in time. So it implies even the absence or the negation of infinity, or maybe even time itself. And of course, paradoxical thinking isn't for everyone. It takes quite a while to understand this mode of thinking, or even the amount of humor that it brings. But nevertheless, it provides the NSK state with a inventory of techniques or weaponry, if you want, that transcends the basically limited means of the art world as such, and yeah, grabs out and expands beyond the sphere of art into the sphere of cultural politics, which is something that makes it unique. But maybe Alexei can say something a little bit more on that, because I think he's more deeply involved in the politics of NSK State, if you want.
I can, but maybe in a sort of devil's advocate mode.
Of course, do the paradox.
Slight cautionary notes, perhaps.
The devil needs no advocates in 2023. Come on.
Well, true. It's oversubscribed, but I will mention some devils now. The negation, the paradox that we're talking about is connected to what Zizek theorized as over-identification, which is what he claimed was what Laibach's operation was in the 80s. And what I see in the last decade or so, both in this context of NSK folk art, etc., but also in the wild, in actual politics, actual culture, outside of this temporary walled garden that we have. When somebody attempts to emulate this kind of complex theoretical or artistic operation and it fails, it becomes what I'm calling ultra identification. So then it's no longer deconstructing, it's no longer introducing doubt, it's actually directly affirmative. Now, sometimes that's accidentally, as a kind of byproduct of a hazardous operation. You know, I used to talk about NSK in terms of cultural reprocessing. So, you know, now and again, the reactor will go critical, or somebody will spoil the uranium will go over the place. What you also get sometimes is knowing or conscious ultra identification. So using the toolkit, but using it from the right. And I've seen this quite a bit in the context of what I call Trump Kunst, which is, you know, this very affirmative, pro-Trump, pro-MAGA, vulgarized mode of art. But some of it is actually sometimes explicitly influenced by Laibach and NSK, sometimes just in the mode of. And I found an interesting example recently, which I think was in Texas. And this is real. This is maybe going back even before Laibach and NSK to the late 70s, early industrial culture in Britain, information warfare, etc. Now, this conservative group, in order to create confusion, destabilization, they put up a big billboard saying, and apparently in the name of the Latino community, saying something like, this Christmas, we must all support pregnant Latino men, Latinx men. So that is the first example I've seen of the toolkit being used with clear malicious intent and from the right. And it's actually, it's not just, I've seen, in the last few years, I've seen quite a few crude or failed attempts, but they tend to if I don't really function apart from those who are already convinced. This one actually caused quite a furore, and it did actually disrupt. And the whole alt-right and libertarian axis is based on disruption. So the toolkit is a manual for disruption. So we don't have a guarantee that it doesn't become ultra identification, that it doesn't become malicious. But having said that, I'm not going to argue that we should now, that the secret's out and that we should now stop using it. But just to be aware that, this kind of discussion, the books, all the literature around NSK State Laibach, it is studied closely, both by that side of the spectrum, also, I'm sure, by state elements seeking to understand what's going on. So we should just be wary of spilling out too much of the internal workings of this, because none of this the mystique wouldn't have been built up without mystery and ambiguity. So
yeah, well, it only works because of its deadpanness. Right?
Yeah.
That's the only way it functions. I mean, so again, the comparisons that I use on teaching this is on the right, the Lucian Vintrich Twinks for Trump thing that he did around the time of the 2018 election, which is like astonishingly, I mean, it's horrible and cruel and nasty, but it's kind of brilliant in a disgusting way. But I think on the other side, there's been very little good anti-Trump or Trump era art at all. But I think the one exception to that, really, probably the only exception that I can think of even from within the art world, the mainstream art world, is Andres Serrano's project, which felt very kind of in keeping, where he just put on a show of loads of Trump stuff, like with no didacticism, just collected and bought, off of eBay and auction sites, things like slices of cake from Trump and Ivana's wedding and uniforms from the Trump properties, and just sort of did this curatorial project of Trump ephemera and presented a kind of vision of Trump in a particular way. But I think exactly what you're talking about, like it's such a dangerous and complicated and difficult line to walk. I mean, part of me thinks with hope in a way that the people, our enemies, if I may be so bold, the people on the other side of the conversation aren't smart enough either to deal with this stuff. There's plenty of people on our side of the conversation who aren't smart enough to do it. But I think it's a very complicated line to walk. And I mean, again, for me, the Liberation Day film is like such a beautiful illustration of how difficult that line is to walk, but how brutally powerful it is if you walk it correctly. And I think, I think you're right to be sort of flagging those worries, Alexi, because we see them, right?
I suppose that if there wasn't a degree of, let's say, danger or risk with embracing a particular aesthetic, there probably wouldn't be almost the sort of resonance or vibrance in it as well. So it's kind of like goes with the territory. Cool. Well,
I will have to break off for a moment because I have a situation, but I'll rejoin you shortly.
okay.
Perhaps I could just jump in on that again, because it reminded me of recent exhibition actually in Poland in what's it called? The castle, Ujarzowski's castle, which made an exhibition called Identity Politics. Alexander may know of this. Which was deliberately sort of trying to bait the so-called woke culture people, and it included a work by Dan Park, who was arrested for putting swastikas and boxes labeled Zyklon B, which was the gas used in the Holocaust, in front of a Jewish community center in Malmo. And yeah, I mean, that seems to be almost a literal example of what Alexei is talking about here, a sort of ultra determination rather than a, yeah. Would you agree, Alexander? I mean, the danger is clearly there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the fact that NSK State claims to be totalitarian in the purest sense of the word, all-encompassing, implies that the toolkit could even be applied for means that seem opposed to the state's intents. But having said that, even the opposition would be part of a totalitarian sphere in that sense. So yeah, I think there is a spectrum and a wide field of applications which can produce a variety of reactions, depending on whether or not, I'm not familiar with the details of this particular exhibition in Poland, but from what you've said, it sounds like it was rather an exercise in bad taste and pointless provocation. But to name an example from the opposite point of the spectrum, a couple of weeks ago, right here in the vicinity where I live, in the south of Nuremberg, a graffiti artist and his autistic brother were maltreated and arrested by police because they were of the impression that they had the opportunity to, you know, get hold of a sprayer gang that were doing stuff illegally, which was not the case. But after a recent change in the police laws in both Bavaria, Saxony, and a few other federal states, it is now again possible in Germany, the first time since 1945, to actually put people in under arrest on the idea that they might do something illegal in the future. That was introduced with the argument we should be wary of Islamists, people who might end up preparing terror attacks or something like that. But the first time this was actually put to practice was to arrest people who might otherwise disrupt the fluidly working systems of work and industry and capital by preventing climate activists from actually protesting by putting them behind bars. And an even more shocking example, after that sprayer I had just mentioned, who was, by the way, even promoted by the city of Nuremberg when it still intended to become the cultural capital of Europe in 2025, who's also active internationally and also worked on the Metelkova previously. He did another motive on the wall of a shed, also in rural part of southern Nuremberg, which depicts a oversized postcard featuring two scenes of police brutality and the portrait of a half decomposed skull wearing a black cap and a black uniform vest, whereby the sprayer went to the trouble and replaced everything that might have been a swastika or something other Nazi symbology interdicted by German law for good reason. So formally, he couldn't have been charged with using forbidden symbols, but nevertheless, the head of state of Bavaria argued that the the non-decomposed half of the skeleton's face depicted the minister-president of Bavaria, and thus charged defamation files against the artist, who was sentenced to pay 4,700 euros for defaming our head of the Bavarian state, who a couple of months ago made sure in public that there was going to be no council culture in Bavaria ever. So yeah, quite interesting. And on top of that, he was even charged with using anti-constitutional symbolism and was even sentenced to an even harder punishment, paying fines. I don't know exactly how much, but yeah, the court argued that the skeleton half of the face would represent an SS Totenkopf skull, which of course it doesn't. And it's the first time I've ever heard of such a sentence being made, because that de facto makes every and any rendition of a skull illegal in Germany, which is a joke. On the other hand, the argument was that the design of the cap itself, the uniform cap with the band on top, that this particular, I don't know what it's called, this sort of little strap on top of the cap itself, would indicate and make clear that it is part of an SS uniforms cap, and thus it is representative of an anti-constitutional party or movement or group. And he was thus also found guilty of using anti-constitutional symbolism, which of course is another joke, because the same type of cap design is being worn by, you know, carnival uniforms in Cologne, or the fire brigades, and so on and so on. So what we have here is an obviously politically inclined sentencing of an artist who is obviously too critical for the system to be endured and to go unpunished. And yeah, while this is really, really worrisome in terms of the reactionary having taken over anti-fascist laws, which were passed for good reason in the immediate post-war period in Germany, these anti-fascist laws are now being effectively used against critical artists. And I've had an experience like that myself a couple of years ago before Corona hit. So it's not an individual case. There seems to be a pattern emerging, which is at its core anti-democratic, authoritarian, and reactionary by nature, while the official ideology still tries to sell us the idea that we're living in such an enlightened, progressive, and satisfying democratic state that there's no need to worry that we might ever run the chance of losing our civic rights. But I've come to the conclusion that civic rights are pointless because we're not citizens in Bavaria, but subjects.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from the perspective of the UK, I mean, you know, we certainly of late have seen a very notably right-wing approach to protest, etc., but also the idea that I mean, there's a whole history in the UK of locking people up prior to any kind of crime being done. I mean, going back to the Troubles, going back to internment, looking at the use of control order houses, which have only recently been phased out in favor of something that looked very much like control order houses. And this is often the surprise, I think, for many people, that actually in so-called liberal democracies, that there are decidedly anti-liberal practices and anti-democratic practices, which often people are either unaware of or are quietly, slowly escalating. And suddenly death by 1,000 cuts, and we find that those liberties that we had taken for granted are suddenly not there anymore. But I guess I was asking specifically in the context also of the Ukraine war, because of the fact that Putin has in such a crass way used fascism as a whole rationale for initially for the invasion. I've just come back from a symposium in Czechoslovakia, which was filled with Ukrainian artists who understandably are very upset about the way that Putin has fashioned them as being full of neo-fascist tendencies. And of course, it's not straightforward. I mean, we do know that the remnants of fascist symbols are used in some of those regiments that Putin was complaining about in the beginning. But it seems to me ultimately that, and I wonder what you think about this, are artists in a better position to be able to understand the kind of emotional charge and affective charge that, and the way that it can be manipulated by all sides, really. In a sense, this is what NSK, I think, is kind of reminding us, that it can be used by any authoritarian kind of position, really, whether of the left or the right. But are you know, I mean, are artists, do you think, better equipped to be able to understand that kind of the charge of fascist symbols? Or is this something that we just soberly have to kind of accept and say, okay, you know, they've done that work, but it didn't ring alarm bells for us in good enough time? Or
I think a lot of the, when I'm teaching NSK and Laibach, I show the Geburt einer Nation video, which is, you know, joyful and silly. And I think the silliness is sort of the point here, right? So the obvious historical comparison is the Orange Alternative in Poland. The idea that, you know, authoritarianism is not tolerant. This is what mine and Stephen's colleague Gavin Grindon works on a lot too.
Yeah, I know.
Authoritarianism is not tolerant of absurdity. And I think, in a way, the kind of getting arrested for banal reasons is one of the strategies, right, of this kind of political art making, and you know, for sort of goading an authoritarian regime into arresting you for something quite absurd. It comes with great risk, and it comes with great personal cost, and it comes with, you know, potentially enormous individual and collective price. But I think part of the, I mean, again, sorry to keep going on about it, just because this is the main way I tend to teach about this. In the Liberation Day documentary, there's a moment where Milan is, you know, they're doing that photo shoot in North Korea, and the handler says to Milan, like, your hat looks a bit fascist. And Milan says, no. But of course, like, the point is, it does look a bit fascist. That's sort of the point. So the sort of intolerance of hats, although terrifying for the individuals who are subjected to, you know, punishment for that, the utility or the usefulness of an artistic practice that can show up authoritarianism as absurd is, I think, again, one of the most useful things that NSK, you know, in the toolkit of the NSK, right, that they sort of there's that great bit in the John Oliver clip when he talks about NSK, talk about Laibach going to North Korea, where they show the marching with fascismus clip, and he says, of course this is Kim Jong-un's favorite band. Like, the kind of fact that it's absurd and it's attracting attention in all the wrong ways is sort of the point. I mean, even to mention Serrano again, I think that's probably what Serrano was doing with Piss Christ, and what a lot of these artists who sort of goad political responses are trying to do. There's a version of it that is quite limited, and then there's a version of it which is, you know, hopefully productive, where you find the absurd line, you find the thing that's going to goad your state. I mean, in some respects, I think this is sort of what Just Stop Oil are trying to figure out at the moment in the UK, Extinction Rebellion, not always entirely successfully, I have to say, but trying to goad authorities into arresting you for something that's stupid, such that you can then weaponize the response, is potentially quite useful, but it's fraught with risk and in immense personal cost for any individuals involved. And I don't know how that's playing out in Ukraine. Obviously, right now, I haven't paid enough attention to it, and I think the risks are obviously much more proximate than some of the other examples I've just mentioned. But surely the point is, like, if this is going to work, surely the point is pissing off authorities to the point that you're getting arrested. Like, isn't that part of the strategy? I don't know what you think, Alexander.
I think that's exactly right, because whether or not the line from or between over-identification and what Alexei called ultra-identification, from subversive to affirmative, only manifests in the reaction to the piece and or to the performance or whatever it is that is the cause or the first stone being thrown. I think this weekend I was also at a book presentation, a book which deals with resistant art movements in Russia, by Norma Schneider. The title translates as "Punk Instead of Putin," and she deals with the means and strategies of civil resistance in Russia against the state fascism. How do civilians deal with the oppression they're faced with, even being forbidden to discuss the war in public or even calling it that? And what I found interesting regarding those the descriptions and the events and that you put together was that basically non-artists, civilians, people in the streets who are fed up with the system tend to appropriate artistic means in order to voice their dissent. Obviously, you can't voice much dissent in Russia before they throw you in jail, so even not voicing your dissent can achieve that. So people just covering their mouths with sticky tape in order to protest the silencing laws in Russia can also even be charged with resisting the official state ideological line. So I find this very interesting, because here you have the toolkit being applied in a subversive way to illustrate and highlight the authoritarian leanings of the regime, whereas if we're talking about ultra-identification, you would ultimately find that such actions would not cause the authorities to react in an oppressive way, but rather piss off the sensibilities of civil society, like in the example with the Cyclone B canisters, because they would be perceived as being in bad taste and would thus create a different kind of uproar than would happen when they would send in, armed troops and remove an artwork.
Isn't the tactic to put authorities and authoritarians in a position of, if I don't respond, I look ridiculous. If I do respond, I look ridiculous. Like I think Andre Tot in Hungary is a really good example with his Zero demo, right? Parade through the streets in occupied Hungary with blank or incomprehensible banners. And if you, as an authoritarian regime, engage with that, you acknowledge the shared reality of resistance to your government. If you don't engage with it and you let it happen, people start asking questions about what the hell this is all about, and you encourage resistance. And I think NSK work in that same framework. And I think you're exactly right, Alexander, that the line is so thin, but the tactic only works if either responding or not responding lead in some senses to the same end, right?
Makes me think of that Laibach quote when they say our mission is to make evil lose its nerve. I think that's exactly the point in what you said about authoritarianism and absurdity being incompatible. That's also a very important point, because I found in practice that people with right-wing leanings or ideologically straight-lined conservatives and fascists and so on, they usually lack the sense of self-irony, which is a basic in the toolkit of NSK as well. So whenever I find this sort of irony lacking, I'm being careful. But Charles has raised his hand. I think he's.
Yeah, I was going to call Charles, but to also just chime in, it reminds you of the time that the Eccentric Collective was building giant inflatable hammers, which led to the lovely image of the police having to beat up and arrest inflatable balloons as criminals.
So I was just going to, it's funny, I remember once I was teaching a class, not teaching, I was giving a guest lecture at Stony Brook, and the students there, like when I was trying to explain NSK to them, were just very confused by, like, you know, American students in New York, like, why aren't they out there just yelling what they mean? And having to explain to them these sort of circumstances that NSK had, and Alex, like you just described in Russia, where like you could do that and it would be the last protest you would ever make. You know, it's really, you know, a different sort of setting, and people like, at least the students I talked to didn't like immediately grasp that. But I wanted to give you an example actually of something that happened with me very recently that was actually right with this toolkit, and actually brought to mind some of the examples that NSK had put out of creating that sort of you know, no-win situation for, you know, the censors, whoever they might be in this. So Alex, as you mentioned, I have me in collaboration with David Kay and Val Noir as well are putting out a book about the NSK State currency, the NSK State Reserve, and the currency that we've done. A nice little coffee table book we've been putting together for the last couple of years. And after years of like nursing this through talking to publishers and blah, 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 it's finally like about to maybe happen, you know, sign contracts and everything, and hopefully get to do some stuff this summer, going out and talking about it and so on. And a lot had built up to this. I was very excited about it. So I was at work and happened to mention to my own manager, like when we're setting up my schedule for the year, oh yes, I may not be available at some points during the summer because I might have a book coming out. I have to go talk about this book. And he said, oh, have you talked to compliance about this? Now, I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, anyone else here. Many people have had this experience. But I literally work in a financial institution, which is literally under SEC regulations, where even if they themselves don't do something, if somebody who works for them goes out and does something, they could be fined millions of dollars. And you're looking askance of this. It's more, I don't want to say it's more more innocent than it sounds, but imagine, if you will, the idea of like, okay, I'm at work, I am shorting a whole bunch of stocks, and then I'm going out on my own time and trash talking them on the internet. That's like the basic case. So the SEC has very strong regulations around this, and if they catch somebody doing this in their own time, that company could be responsible for it. So there's good reasons for this. So I was in the awkward position of having to go to the compliance department with my book about the NSK State Reserve and ask them, would you mind if I publish this book where I'm pretending to be a financial institution and printing my own money?
How did that go?
It was, I was really prepared for the worst. I really thought there were like a few basic scenarios that could happen, and anything where they would actually read the book was going to be kind of challenging. I was like, maybe it's not that bad. And I opened it to a random page and it's like, you know, as a reserve bank printing currency, you know, it was like just right there. And it was just like, okay, this isn't going to look good at all. So I was going through scenarios in my mind, and it was like, one of the things that we've done at the Reserve is we've really tried to emulate as much as we could of the actual way that the NSK worked. I mean, as much as we can, being a collective of like 2 people. And you know, it's often led to some interesting, strange circumstances. But, you know, I realized at some point, I don't have to think about what I would do in this case, because this already happened. When it was requested that, you know, Laibach no longer perform. I'm saying requested. Alexi, you've you know in much more detail the exact, government organizations involved in exactly what was required of Laibach when they were asked not to perform. But their response to this was excellent. We were testing the system. The system came through very well. Hats off. So I was completely preparing to redact myself from the book entirely, along with a statement explaining that due to SEC regulations, one of the principal authors couldn't be recognized in this book, and explain all the SEC regulations. And looking forward to that actually somehow ennobling the publication by it somehow being brought within the sphere of this, if you want to call it censorship, you could. I think it's
Charles, do you know the work of Genpei Akasagawa, the Japanese artist from the 60s? So he basically had the same problem you did, but in the late 1960s in Japan. He published
publishing his own money to buy other money.
That's right. Yeah. He published
this.
And he had there was a whole court case in Japan about whether he was an artist or not. And that was sort of the defense about no, I'm just an artist. And basically the court ruled yeah, you're just an artist, but you're still not allowed to print your own money. So,
right.
It became a whole kind of engaged, I teach a class for our, law students here when I talk about this. This is a kind of art historical engagement or an artistic engagement in the law, and the fact that I'm just an artist is not a defense. I mean, someone mentioned Brian Holmes earlier on, just a good defense of that. So you're walking in good, well-trodden art historical.
And it, like I said, I did draw some comfort from that. Not that case, but yeah, the similar Laibach instance. It's okay, there's actually there's something in the toolkit for this. We've already seen this. As it was, they didn't say anything for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then they simply approved it without asking me anything. So they sort of kept me on tenterhooks for a while, and then just said, "Well, what are you doing? Get out of here." And
well, that kind of makes sense in a way that it's clear from, I mean, I haven't obviously read the book, but I'm gonna guess here that you're actually not trying, you're not intending to do any of the things which the Securities Exchange Commission would be trying to actually stop.
Yes, but it would not have taken much lack of imagination, if that works syntactically. It would not have taken much lack of imagination for somebody to just say, I don't want to deal with this. Fuck no. Through decision fatigue or whatever, and just denied it. But yeah, I agree. They're actually there is nothing in there that would actually affect anyone's portfolio in any way that would matter to them. But
you probably provided amusing dinner time anecdotes for a number of some professional mid-level bureaucrats saying, honey, guess what happened at work today? You're not going to believe this one.
If I'm entertaining the people in compliance, I feel like I've accomplished something. So that's that's good.
Well, that's the kind of interesting effect where you get the dialogue with the institution, either the response or the non-response. And Laibach used to talk about the state as its primary audience.
Right.
So not even us as co-creators or people who've taken it further, but the institutions it's in dialogue with. That's where you can get the really rich responses.
Right. I'll keep trying. Hopefully someday I'll be.
Well, no, kudos. I mean, I think that's already significant.
Well, on that thought, I think we should probably maybe move towards wrapping up at some point. So we're not, maybe with that, I'll just ask if anyone has any sort of closing ideas or things you want to say, or ways to keep generating more unexpected responses and dialogues with states and people that we didn't see coming.
Well, possibly. I can't be more specific than that, but pointing out to Charles in particular that this October's book fair in Frankfurt is going to feature Slovenia as guest country. On that occasion, Laibach are going to perform Alamut in Frankfurt, along with the Slovenian Radio and Television Orchestra and Choir. And apart from that, I know from the editor of the Gesamtkunstwerk Laibach book, Uwe Schütte, that a second edition is being planned for the fall, as well as a German collection of Peter Mlaka speeches, prose and philosophical essays. So there's going to be a phalanx of publications coming for October. And I imagine all the Slovenes panicking about what can we put out in time till October to, you know, get the train running. So my question to you, Charles, would be, is there any chance we're going to see the State Reserve book in time till October?
It's looking good. It's looking good.
That's great to hear. I can only recommend working with Jean. It was such a pleasurable working process and experience to and I mean, I'm quite perfectionist, so I was really worried I might wear him out over the course of the production of the final layout stages. Mm-hmm. But he never complained. He's a true soldier and a true professional, and yeah, I'd sing his praise any time of day. Mm-hmm. So I feel incredibly happy and satisfied to see the book coming out in time.
No, it will be great to see that in print. That'll be great. I think that our schedule is something like to actually release it in September, so that would work out timing wise. For David and I being on this side of the Atlantic, it makes it, you know, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to go back and forth to do that, but it would be really great to see you there. So
I'm sure we'll have no trouble finding proper representatives or yeah, messengers for the cause. Awesome. And also maybe I don't know, I think a few people from Slovenia are also listening in. There are plans to have a book presentation for weapons of mass destruction featuring Peter Mlaka, and who knows who else is going to be around for June 21st at the Slovene Ethnographic Museum. And I'm hoping I'm not spoiling anything here, because it's all in the talks. I'm not sure in how far it's already fixed, but this is the next big date I'm looking forward. So just to give a little view into the future, at least concerning NSK State activities in 2023, there's a couple of things we might be looking forward to with pleasure.
Cool. Any final thoughts from you, Willie or Alexi or Matt?
I would just return to the negative elements briefly, in terms of what we were, which I think Bernadette was alluding to, the lack of engagement with the younger audience, or the, you know, seeing NSK as history or purely historical, irrelevant. We do have a bit of a succession issue. In terms of the activists and the audience, it's primarily a Gen X phenomenon. It hasn't filtered down that much. And I remember saying this even at the NSK Congress in 2010, that it can't, for it to live, it can't keep being the same people organizing and taking initiatives. It has to find another cadre, another group. And also, the more that the same people repeat it, the less you get the improbable effects. I think what Charles and the Reserve are doing is a very interesting exception to that, because that, I'd say at the moment, that's the most NSK of NSK projects in terms of its aesthetics and its effects, and that's working well. But of course, it's still a Gen X project. So I would appeal to, you know, people who do want to keep this going, and who are activists or idealists or enthusiasts, to, you know, and I don't know what the answer is at all, but
and
No,
I don't know what Bernadette
yeah,
thinks,
go
but
on.
I teach this stuff every year
Right.
to undergrads and to postgrads, and they're always like super excited and blown away by it. How many of them go on and engage with it more? It's difficult to say, but I think like there is an appetite for it amongst Gen Z people. I mean, I'm just about a millennial, so I'll resist that Gen
Right.
that Gen X just about. But
You
I
know,
don't know.
I'm talking about really us.
But you're right. I think you're 100% right. And how we turn communicating about the history of NSK into an active NSK participation with 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25-year-olds. I don't know exactly, but it's the right question to ask, Lexi, I think.
Probably involves TikTok.
Perhaps, yeah. Yeah. But also to bear in mind, to be aware of over discussing and over analyzing, which is ridiculous for me to say in relation to NSK in one sense. However, a bit of tactical caution and a bit of not trailing too much, not announcing things in advance, which I think is a massive problem with a lot of political and artistic interventions, where like, we will be here on this day, we will be giving this message. No, you don't do that. You act, and you don't necessarily explain, you don't necessarily even claim responsibility.
Well, it's kind of like that line that Nietzsche has in Beyond Good and Evil, where it says that artists always prefer being misunderstood to being totally understood.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So these are my themes: continuity and tactical awareness.
In terms of generational changes, I've come to the conclusion from observing certain processes in the recent past and the rise of what I used to call soft totalitarianism since the 90s, in terms of neoliberal policies and so on. I think the millennial generations sooner or later will be forced to deal with the authoritarian rise of the right and the reactionary backlash we've seen since the comparatively liberal leanings of the 68 post-hippie, post-student uprising generation, which has been replaced in the nomenclature of most Western states by the people who are in charge now, and even younger people whose liberal ideas are inevitably going to clash with the system's requirements, especially when there's going to be a larger reactionary capital crackdown on climate activists and so on, and resistance to climate change politics, which are a basic necessity these days, but certain power structures are still keen on preventing these changes. So the young generation is going to be forced to deal with all these things, and I think, or I expect, that they'll come to the conclusion that I've come to when dealing with NSK and NSK State, especially now in doing that book, is the recognition that art these days is not a luxury, but a necessity. And they'll have to adopt the NSK State toolkit in order to get away with any kind of subversive or over-identification practices, especially in the digitized and tightly controlled future. They will have to resort to those practices, whether they reinvent them or whether they take them from the already existing toolkit is of secondary importance.
If I may just jump in briefly in response to Alexi's question there as well. I mean, I think one of the really interesting themes or occurrences that I see emerging, certainly amongst my students, is that they're not in an art historical ghetto. That actually what's interesting to them about NSK, once you kind of talk them around, is that this is not, these are not simply a bunch of artists And I think, you know, there's a generation, a younger generation, who see art as being something that can be deployed along with other kind of political tools in a way which doesn't easily or too swiftly describe itself as art. And for me, this is actually very inspiring to see the way that, you know, you have artists, anthropologists, journalists, ethnographers, and they're all working together to understand something like, and I think certainly my students are extremely concerned about the rise of the far right, and that means an examination not just of their politics, but also of their aesthetics, their aesthetic strategies, the way they style themselves, the way they position themselves to be attractive to young people, and the kind of drawing together of these different strands of thinking into an anti-disciplinary kind of project, a much more collectivizing kind of set of concerns. I mean, they get that from NSK. And they're also, I think, doing that. You know, they're not stopping to think, is this art? Is this politics? You know, they're just getting on with maybe doing politics differently, or at least that's what we try to encourage our students to do. And that may be using artistic methodologies, it may be using creative methodologies, it may be using artificial intelligence, it may be using a range of things. But I think they get the need for a kind of urgent and collective response. And also, one of the things that I think they're inspired by NSK about is the fact that it exceeds or undermines the notion of the state. I mean, young people are very much belonging to a social media generation that, as we know, you know, from Telegram activism to any kind of social media platform, that that their response is, it just cannot be contained by these singular categories. And you know, I think NSK, this is what NSK offers us. It offers us an alternative to something that is too quickly and easily caught in a particular kind of institutional framework. So perhaps that leaves us with a mixture of both doubt and idealism, as as Stephen styled it in the beginning.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And I hope everyone gets to check out the book. I've read a bit of it; it's quite good. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you
I
so
ordered
much.
it while we were talking. Like, it's on its way.